Let's start the debate with this question. Establishing what we mean by sex and what we mean by gender. Helen Joyce.
Sex is biology. It's the thing that allows for sexual reproduction. It's the thing that's existed on this planet for more than 1 billion years. In mammals, half the mammals are male, half the mammals are female, and we're mammals. So half of us are men, half of us are women. That can't change. Mammals can't change sex. Some other animals can. Gender is an ambiguous word. Some people use it as a polite synonym for sex. Some people mean the stereotypes that people perform. Some people mean an inner feeling that's hard to define. So I tend not to use that word because it's too ambiguous.
What about you, Helen Webberley? What do you mean or establish by the word sex and gender?
Well, everyone says that sex is biology, and Helen here has just said that it's about reproduction. But there's, the chromosomes, the sexual function, the reproductive system, it's very various in humans, and to say that there's just one or the other is incorrect. There aren't just two ways that a body can be made. But whereas gender is a deep personal identity of somebody, of how somebody lives their life, how they express themselves, how they see themselves, and that's, as we know, is completely unrelated to their chromosome pattern or their organs, their anatomy.
What do you say about that complete distinction that is being made there by Helen Webberley in terms of gender?
I mean, first, it's just not true. There are only two sexes. And the reason there are only two sexes is because there are only two gametes. And the gametes are the thing that define the sexes. This is established in biology. But then this deep inner feeling, if sex is so nebulous, as Helen Webberley says, then how on earth is somebody meant to have this deep inner feeling? Like, what does it mean to feel like a boy or a girl if you don't even know what boy and girl mean? This just sounds like personality to me, or I don't know what it sounds like. It's just not defined.
Helen Webberley?
Well, it's like, what do you mean by personality? Okay, if it is personality, what's wrong with that? It's how somebody wishes to live their life. It's how somebody sees themselves,
so stereotypes.
How somebody fits into this world.
Stereotypes?
Well, why is personality a stereotype? I don't see it as a stereotype. And what do you mean by that?
But I mean, like, to call it something that's to do with being a boy or a girl, like, what? I mean, I just don't know what you mean. If a child comes out of the mother, everyone says that's a little boy because that's the body of a little boy, and then at some point that child says that they have a girl gender identity. What does that child mean if girl doesn't mean anything? If girl just means people
who said girl doesn't mean anything?
Well, you did, because you haven't given us a definition.
I say
it's just circular. You've just said, it's a deep personal identity.
You said.
And you said that girls, there are many sexes. Sex is varied. It could be chromosomes. It's nothing to do with your biology. You haven't given us something that somebody could talk about as a target for what it might mean to think that you are like a girl. You just had gone around in circles.
Well, goodness, I didn't think I'd had enough words to go around in circles, but there you go. I mean, your comment was there are only two sexes,
yep.
and that's because there are only two gametes.
Yep.
I think to boil the whole of humanity down to gametes, and for those who don't know what gamete is, it's basically an egg or a sperm. To say that the whole of humanity is to be dictated by whether your body produces eggs or sperm is so mathematical, so binary, so basic. It's actually a basic misunderstanding of biology.
No boiling down, no reducing to. We just come in two types. You're a boy or you're a girl. Do anything you like. Do not let it hold you back. Go to the moon, be the president, anything you like, but you'll still be a boy or still be a girl.
But you've boiled it down to gametes. You're saying you either have ovaries or testicles, but there are many different variations.
There really are
people who are. But you're not a biologist. You're not a doctor. How do you know? You sit there shaking your head saying there really aren't.
What are the variations, Helen Webberley?
Well, in terms of biology, which is, I think, Helen Joyce is trying to explain, we do have chromosomes, and there are many different patterns of chromosomes. That we do have reproductive organs, and there are different variations. Not everybody is born with XX and two ovaries, a womb.
Are you talking about
vagina.
intersex? People being born intersex?
Well, you can use that term. There's many different chromosomal patterns.
But what does this have to do with gender identity anyway?
Well, no, because they're completely different. Exactly. You're grasping it. So biological sex is very different to gender identity, absolutely. And one is not dictated by the other.
There are two body plans, and there are sometimes anomalies, and they are very rare, but there are only two body plans.
Can I just put this question to you, Helen Webberley, about bodies, about biology?
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the proportion of trans women in terms of operations or surgery to remove their penises, what number are we talking about? What proportion, roughly, of trans women have had that kind of surgery?
I don't think we know that data, but when I last looked at that kind of data, I think around about 12% of people who reassign their sex choose to have genital surgery.
So it's low?
12%.
Yes, I mean, that is low. Would you agree?
Well, it depends what level you're comparing it with.
Well, I'm comparing it to anything that's above 12%, but it is a pretty low figure. Does that surprise you?
No. That's about what I thought it was too. Most trans women are just completely standard physiological men.
Right. I mean, taking that into account, Helen Webberley, do you think that a predatory man would ever use a transgender identity to get into a female-only space, like a hospital ward, a prison, or a changing room?
I think it's a very dangerous thing to associate transgender women with predatory men. So some men, whether they are trans women in identity or whether they are male in identity, some people, if you like, who have XY chromosomes, if we leave it there, will be predatory. But the difficulty is when we make that association that trans women automatically equals predator.
Well, I don't think anyone will say it automatically equals it, but at the same time, Helen Webberley has a point. It is a dangerous thing to link the two if we're talking about predatory men across the piece.
What's very dangerous is taking down the boundaries that keep male people out of spaces that female people need there to be no male people in.
But a predatory man might gain entry in some way or another.
And so do you leave your front door open when you go out just because a burglar might get in? Otherwise, we can't, nothing is foolproof. We have systems in order to safeguard. No safeguarding is perfect. We say no male people here, knowing that some men may come in, but the rule is clear cut. It's no men, it's no male people. And when we soften that boundary, we make it easier for bad people to come in. The people who use loopholes are precisely the worst people. So we have to be very clear, and that's no male people. The people who use loopholes are the worst people. If you have a loophole, bad people go through it.
Do you think there should be those protections then to reduce and minimise the risk that somebody might ever use or abuse? As you say, you don't want it equated with transgender or being a trans woman, that they should be minimised when it comes to sharing those spaces.
Well, I think what Helen said was that no male should enter a female space, and I think we solved the argument because transgender women are female. They are female, and
biologically male, Helen Joyce would say.
She might say, but the Equality Act...
And many people would.
Well, if I might just go back to the Equality Act. The Equality Act protects two characteristics. It protects sex, and it also protects gender reassignment. And gender reassignment in the Equality Act is reassigning your sex. That's what the definition is.
But you have said it's a very, well, I said it was a low figure, but you said it's only around 12% who have that sort of surgery.
Which doesn't change your sex anyway.
Excuse me. The surgery is unrelated to that. In the Equality Act, your gender reassignment, you don't have to have surgery.
Can I just ask you then, Helen Joyce, how comfortable are you that under the leaked guidance that we've had today, the Supreme Court was very clear that biological sex is the definition of a woman and a man. And for the purposes of the Equality Act, in that sense, we can talk about protected characteristics later on, but in terms of the Equality Act, the leaked document implies that there will be transgender people who have lived in their acquired gender, perhaps for decades. They could be confronted and questioned about their sex. That's undignified and intrusive, isn't it?
What's undignified and intrusive is coming into a space that is not for your sex, that is there for the other sex. Nobody should be trying to use a space that is not for their sex. Helen Webberley said that gender reassignment changes people's sex. It doesn't. It doesn't do that in reality, and it doesn't do it in law. They're separate characteristics. The Supreme Court was very clear on that. So a trans woman is a man for the purposes of the Equality Act and in reality. And we can all tell who the men and the women are by using our eyes and ears. It's how humanity has done it all along.
How can you tell? How can you always tell that somebody who, yes, maybe arrives at a communal changing room, maybe goes to the theatre and wants to use the loos, the lavatories that their gender have acquired, what is it that tells you immediately, I know what sex you are?
Are you ever puzzled when you look at the people around you, what sex they are? Because I'm not. And it's no one feature. We're very, very good at recognising sex. It's a sealing attribute of humans that we can tell what sex people are. 99.99% accuracy, instantaneously.
Well, I clearly disagree with that. And I think, to boil down in 2025 in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, that we're actually going to let people's, what they look like, dictate which facility or service they're allowed to use by what they look like. I can't believe that we would even think to go back to that.
If you saw a 6'2" man with a beard and he was speaking and you could hear his voice was very deep and he went into the ladies' changing room after a 6-year-old girl, would you think there might be something wrong here?
Helen, you talk about your arguments are always, it's got to be over 6 foot.
No, I'm just asking you, I'm giving you a specific example.
And I'm answering. And it's got to go in after a 6-year-old girl and it's a man.
But yes or no?
I haven't finished. Can you let me finish? The thing is, we're talking, and used to call him a man. Men don't go into the female spaces.
Sometimes
women
they do.
And transgender women are women and they go into female spaces. And the fact that you portray this 6 foot man over 6 foot going in after a girl, all the image you want to give is this man is so dangerous. I don't think that we in our society should be portraying men as automatically dangerous.
But what is your answer to the specific? Just for argument's sake, if you saw that scenario, what would you be thinking, Helen Webberley?
If I saw a 6 foot man going into a female...
Well, don't worry too much about the height, but yes, a bloke, a big
someone
man...
Someone you can really tell is clearly male.
What would be going through your mind?
You're answering. If that is a transgender female, they have the right to go in whatever they look like. We can't be the looking police. We can't say, excuse me, you don't look... female enough to go into my toilet. It's just an awful place to be.
I mean, where are trans women supposed to go, Helen Joyce?
Can I just point out that this means that anyone can go into the ladies, anyone can go into the gents, because we're literally not meant to be able to say to anybody, it's clear that you're not a man, it's clear that you're not a woman. So this is just an end to all sex-separated spaces. So, I mean, where are transgender women meant to go to the toilet? If they're not happy using the men's, which is where they should go because they are men, then hopefully there's a gender-neutral option for them. If there isn't, I'm afraid they're going to have to use the men's, because what is out of order is using the women's because they are not women, they are male.
What do you say to that, Helen Webberley?
The Equality... I'm just going to go back to real basics. The Equality Act protects people who reassign their sex. And you don't have to have had surgery, you don't have to take hormones, you reassign your sex. And people like Helen Joyce will always say, oh goodness, they're just going to go in and pretend. But there are over 262,000 transgender people in our country who need the security to go into spaces that align with their gender identity. And frankly, for us to sit here and permit the language that says a transgender woman is a man is against the law, because and actually the Crown Prosecution Service would consider that as a hate crime. Transgender women are women.
But in terms of the Supreme Court ruling, it has said very clearly, for the purpose of the Equality Act, that sex is biological.
Yes. So remember we said earlier that the Equality Act looks at two characteristics, sex and gender reassignment. But the Supreme Court ruling, which is only an interpretation of the law, and there are many who say that it's not, does not say that, as you mentioned earlier, and if I might disagree with you, it does not say that transgender women are men. It still absolutely protects transgender women as women, but then when it was talking about sex as a protected characteristic, it said for the sex one we are talking about biology, but it didn't erase the gender reassignment as a protected characteristic, which means it's real.
It hasn't erased gender reassignment surgery, but for the
purposes,
not
surgery, gender reassignment.
But for the purposes of people who are providing services and single spaces, sex is biological. That was
it
very
didn't say
clear.
that.
Well, that
No, it
was
didn't
very
say
clear.
that.
Well, we can debate that.
I will just say Sex Matters intervened on the winning side in the Supreme Court judgment, and we were thanked for our submissions. What you've just heard from Helen Webberley is completely wrong. Our submissions were accepted, and of course what the Supreme Court says is the law. This is ridiculous to say they aren't the law.
On that, gender medicine next. We're going to talk about adults and then children. Don't go anywhere. This is the Times Radio Gender Debate with me, Jo Coburn, and two Helens, leading feminist Helen Joyce and Helen Webberley, who founded Gender GP. We're going to get on to the treatment of children in a moment, but first let's talk about adults. Helen Joyce, if an adult has thought long and hard about it and they want to take hormones and they might even want to have surgery, what should we as a society be offering them?
I think you've got to treat it like extreme cosmetic surgery, which isn't banned, but, it's not something that changes your status in law. It's not something that's funded publicly, and it's really buyer beware. There's not many doctors want to do those sorts of things. We heard some total misinformation on the subject of the Equality Act and the Supreme Court before the break, but the fact is that what the Supreme Court said is that people who go through these sorts of surgeries will not change their status in terms of single-sex spaces or services or sports or any of those things. They will stay being the sex they are. If they still want that surgery,
yes,
then that's their business. But they can't then say that they can use the opposite sex
But my question
spaces.
is, what should we be offering them as a society?
Forbearance. No legal status change.
But what about services? And what about more people perhaps offering the sorts of services that Helen Webberley is offering?
Well, I'd like to see it treated like any other form of medicine, that people show us, decent studies that show that this improves quality of life, because none have.
Right. Helen Webberley, should it be on demand for adults? Should people have any mental health assessment before taking any treatment, drugs, or having surgery?
I think the person that's missing in this question is the person who's asking for that medical intervention. And I've been a doctor for 33 years, and in the whole of that time, I've never known a medical condition or a medical treatment being debated by mathematicians and statisticians saying it shouldn't be available, or classifying it as.
Do you think
as
it should
extreme.
just be doctors like you?
Well, it's between the doctor and the patient. And that's what medicine is. A patient has a medical condition or a diagnosis, or is requesting a treatment, requesting a pathway, and they go and discuss that with their doctor. The fact that we've widened this out to non-medics to have an opinion on what a patient can have, I can't equate it with any other medical condition.
That's ridiculous. We do this all the time. Epidemiologists and statisticians talk all the time about medicine. I worked for the Royal Statistical Society for many years. My PhD is in mathematics. My second subject was statistics. I literally edited the magazine of the Royal Statistical Society. I interviewed the statisticians who, after the Second World War, worked out how randomised control trials worked. We absolutely do not just say, this is what you want. We actually work out what works in medicine. And by the way, the rest of us pay for this through the NHS. So the idea that this is just the patient comes in and says what they want and the doctor gives it to them, the rest of us just go along with that. That's completely absurd and absolutely not how it works.
With respect, I don't know whether you hold a statistics role in medicine at the moment, but there are many different types of statistics. But also, we have to understand that medicine and the NHS has a constitution. It has a list of things it will fund. There have been people in the past who say, for example, if you have lung cancer because you smoked, why should you sap our costs? If you ride a motorbike and you were reckless, why should we treat you? So we don't do that in medicine. And if there is a case for gender affirming care, which the NHS has decided that there is, and of course also there are private options, the NHS isn't the only option, then it's between the doctor and the patient to decide what's appropriate.
Although you would agree broadly that society can discuss these things, particularly if there are ethical questions.
They can have their discussions, but I think when we're missing the patient in the room, and the trans community are certainly not saying, please, can you ban gender affirming care? The trans community just want to live their life. They just want to get on and be happy, and not have society and politics coming in saying, we don't think you should have that.
Well, we'll come on to society and politics maybe a little later on, but let's talk about children, because the Tavistock Clinic, the only clinic that was offering the gender identity development service, was closed down because of concerns raised by the paediatrician Dr. Hilary Cass in her review last year. She said gender medicine had been operating on shaky foundations and that the evidence for puberty blockers was remarkably weak. Helen Webberley, until recently, this country was broadly following that path that the Tavistock was offering. Do you admit and accept that you've lost the argument? It's been shut down. It was the only service. There are some regional hubs, but people have decided, government who commissioned that review and Dr. Hilary Cass, that the evidence just isn't there.
I think the mistakes happened many years before the Cass review with the Tavistock Clinic. It was a single clinic.
Well, it was the only one.
Yes, but which is highly unusual in the United Kingdom. You'd have several clinics, even for highly specialised services. It was one clinic operating its own protocols, and it was criticised way before the Cass review. It was criticised by the Care Quality Commission. But the criticism was the way that the clinic was operating. But I don't think that should now mean that we don't follow the international standards and guidance for treating transgender children, which unfortunately, because we have society and politicians coming in, is what's happened.
Helen Joyce.
So I think that probably Helen Webberley is talking about WPATH and its standards of care, which suggest very much the model that she uses, which is that...
Actually, I was talking about the Endocrine Society.
Right, but would you agree? I mean, you've praised WPATH many times, so can I talk
today?
about WPATH? No, I just mean generally.
Well, you said I was referring to WPATH. I was referring to the Endocrine Society.
Okay, but would you agree...
But explain what WPATH is.
So WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and it's regarded as the organisation that promotes gender-affirming care. I think broadly speaking, it will be the organisation that will be promoting the model that Helen Webberley would
excuse me, I'm talking about the Endocrine Society.
No, but can I ask, do you agree that the WPATH is a good example of the sort of care that you would... That's genuinely a question.
The WPATH have published peer-reviewed standards of care. The Endocrine Society have published and endorsed international clinical guidelines. There's a difference. But
no, I understand, but I'm asking you, do you think the WPATH is standards of care is the right way to practice for children?
It is the global, internationally recognised standards of care, peer-reviewed by over 210 gender specialists.
And what are those standards of care as you understand them, Helen
As I
Joyce?
understand them, it's very much led by what the child says. And so it's if the child says that... the child has an identity and so on, you affirm that. You socially transition the child, you present them as the opposite sex or as non-binary, and then you consider blocking their puberty, and then you consider cross-sex hormones if that's what the child wants to fulfil their embodiment goals.
And that's what was going on at the Tavistock Clinic, Helen Webberley?
Yeah.
No, I think they were actually much more conservative than that. So WPATH is very, very much more lax than... They don't particularly suggest any particular investigations beforehand.
And you think that's wrong, to follow the child, the lead of the child?
Yes, absolutely.
You don't?
Well, again, we have a non-medic interpreting and saying no investigations. I'm like, well, which investigation do you want? Does Helen Joyce think that they should be doing? Which investigation? I'm just interested.
Right, but how young should you listen to a child who is saying, I would like to change my gender?
They're not changing their gender. They're saying that their gender is different to the one that everyone's calling them. And the time that you listen is the first time that they say it. Because you have to understand...
And what age could that be?
Well,
in your experience?
In my experience, it's around about 4 or 5 that children start having a sense of self, a sense of identity. Really? And they might, at that age, kind of start saying, you're calling me a boy, but actually I'm a girl.
And you would listen to that at the age of 4 or 5?
Absolutely listen.
But listen to it and then take action.
Well, but what action? Because this is what people think. People think, oh goodness, then we're going to give puberty blockers. That doesn't come till much, much later. But the concept of believing a child and helping them explore their feelings is really important.
Hold that point for a moment, because we're going to talk about the specifics of what you have just begun describing, of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and how Gender GP, your firm, operates after the news with Graham Stothard. Oh, or maybe not. We're going to come back to puberty blockers a little quicker than I thought. In terms of the child, let me just continue this thread. Listening to Helen Webberley saying you should always believe a child, I think you said. Listen to a child and at some point take action. What's wrong with that, Helen Joyce?
I think there's 2 ways to listen to a child. One is that the child says something like, I think, Mummy, I'm really a girl. I'm talking about a boy saying this, say. and you say, oh, that's interesting, why do you think that? What do you think that girls can do? What is it that you want to do that you think you can't do as a boy? Because the thing is, you are actually a boy, and that's not going to change. It can't change. Children are very literal minded. They don't mean this airy-fairy sex and gender are different. And it's very cruel to tell a child they can do something that is actually just not going to be possible. They believe it, and they maybe act on it, and then later on it turns out not to have been true.
I mean, do you accept that children change their minds? These are shifting thoughts.
What is essential is two things. One, Helen Joyce in her response, again, completely denies the existence of gender reassignment or gender incongruence, and I think that's a very dangerous thing to let pass. On the other hand, I think it's really important that we listen to children and we understand and we help them explore. But this blanket, no, you cannot be a boy because you are a girl. I've worked with so many children and families. It's crucially and excruciatingly painful for that child to hear their parents say, you can't do this, because the transgender people of today, the adults, have all been a child. They've all been through that process. And I've heard the ones that have said, my mum said no, 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 or my mum let me explore what gender identity was for me. And there's a huge difference in the outcome to how
but
these children develop.
exploring conversations is one thing, Helen Webberley.
Yeah.
Taking action, you said later on, that comes later on. What age, what's the earliest age you would give a child puberty blockers?
When puberty starts.
Which is?
Well,
the youngest age would be?
I think probably around 9 is the earliest, but there will be children earlier. Because, of course, don't forget that puberty can start in a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. So we give a puberty blocker to a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old but people don't seem to think that that's not a problem. They don't think that's a problem. But it's only when it's a transgender child that it becomes a problem. We use puberty blockers across all ages, whenever puberty starts, when it's damaging or inappropriate for that child. But
what do you understand by informed consent, Helen Webberley?
Informed consent means that you have the informed bit means the information. Right. So the doctor has the medical information, the patient has the personal information. You share that information and you come to an agreement of consent. So informed consent.
But in what world people will be listening to this is a child have or possess the capability to have informed consent at the age of 8?
But we perform medical interventions on children of 8 all the time.
Yes, but with the child asking for it.
But asking what? So you're not allowed to ask. It's like have a broken arm, cancer treatment, diabetes, respiratory medicine. We're treating children all the time.
No, treating children is one thing. I'm talking about the issue of consent.
Yeah.
That you would take the word of an 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old.
It's crucial to. It's crucial to listen to these children, because I've seen what happens when you don't. And it's really painful.
All right, well, we'll see what happens later on in terms of when you don't. What do you say in response to that?
There's no other treatment that we would give a totally healthy child that disrupts normal physiological development. Puberty is an absolutely crucial process. It's the process that turns children into adults. Delaying an catastrophically early puberty is not the same as interrupting normal puberty. Everything else that we do for children is because something isn't working. They've got a broken arm, they've got diabetes, they've got all these other things wrong that Helen Webberley said. This is different. This is taking a child's counterfactual claim. And listen, it's not me that's being mean, it's nature that's being mean here. It is not possible to turn boys into girls or vice versa. It literally isn't possible. So doing this sort of intervention on the basis that you can is just sheer wanton cruelty.
I mean, you were, Helen Webberley, found guilty of serious misconduct by the General Medical Council, later overturned. And this was over a child that was given puberty blockers by you. You call it a pause in terms of the development to give a child time to think. This child
I haven't called it that. I haven't called it that, by the way, but you put those words into my mouth.
Well, no, but I have heard you in other interviews because I listened before I did this debate this evening, and that was the word you used, to give a child time to think. This child was apparently adamant that they didn't want children. How on earth can a child know?
The thing is, I don't think we should base the whole of the care of transgender adults, young children, adolescents, adults on one case. Yeah. So for sure, in the United Kingdom, we don't have adequate standards of care, which is actually what arose the Tavistock travesty, and it's a real problem. So, but I don't think that one case in my GMC tribunal, which, as you say, was overturned. Yes. So the High Court found that the GMC were wrong to find that serious misconduct.
But my question is, how can a child know?
I just need to you need to allow me to clear my name, because the serious misconduct that you stated from the GMC
I said it was
overruled. But yes. I don't think that we should base the whole of transgender care for young people on my tribunal. There's a whole wealth of evidence out there.
Yes, but my question, and just before I come back to you, Helen Joyce, my question is, how can a child know at a young age if they do or don't want children?
Well, Jo, what I reckon you should do really is get the parents and the children in here. Once you've met as many transgender children and families as I have, and also spoken to adults who once were a transgender child, then maybe you'll change your mind. But for me at the moment, I'm their spokesperson, and it is true. Transgender people, whatever Helen Joyce says, transgender people exist. There are people who were assigned a sex at birth which turns out not to be their gender identity. They do exist, and some of those people wish to take medical intervention to switch their hormone profile.
And I'm talking about age and consent and due diligence. But what do you say in response? Let me give you a scenario, Helen Joyce. You're a parent and you have a child that comes to you and says, I want to change my gender, for argument's sake.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as I know, even anecdotally, of a parent saying no, and that's the end of the story.
I'd say, let's talk about that. What do you mean by that? Let's say it's a boy, just so I'm not constantly having to switch. What would be different about your life if people thought you were a girl, or if you were a girl? Is it something that you want to do differently? Children have very concrete ideas about things. They think that only boys can do some things and only girls can do some things, or they've just all sorts of, ideas that you need to get to the bottom of. Talking therapy is the right approach here, open-mindedness, but never misleading a child and never using physical interventions for what is clearly a complex psychological issue.
I mean, if someone takes gender-affirming drugs and treatment and later decides it was a mistake, do you consider that they've been harmed, Helen Webberley?
I will answer your question,
yeah.
Sure. But again, for us to ask a non-medic, someone who's not a counsellor, someone who's not a psychologist, not trained in gender medicine, what is the right thing to do with the child, and for that person to come back and say, oh, well, you just need to talk to them and find out what I mean. We should not be basing our medical decisions in this country on the views of non-experts, which is what we're doing with your guest over there.
Well, before then you answer the question, one of the clearest examples was the closing down of the Tavistock clinic. Another example was the chief psychiatrist in Finland, who was pioneering hormone treatment for patients, but then over time discovered, as she has written in a lengthy piece, that actually the majority, I think 90%, she said, of the patients that were coming to her were young girls between the ages of 15 and 17 who were asking to change their gender. They were in the wrong body, but they also were suffering from a range of other conditions that spread from autism to anorexia and depression. And she became very concerned and concluded that they were the main issues, and actually changing gender wasn't going to solve it.
Again, I think we need to be very careful that we're not going on one person's view.
All right, but that's two. That's Hilary Cass at the Tavistock and the Finnish psychiatrist.
That's two. But how come when I, 10 minutes ago, said that the WPATH has over 200 gender experts who've reviewed all of the medical literature and research, and their publication, the Standards of Care, were peer reviewed, and how come we don't accept that? But it's easy for us to accept the one case that you hear in the newspapers, or the one and there have been people at the Tavistock who said a similar thing. But we need to understand the view of multiple experts and not alarmist cases.
Right, that's what they are, alarmist cases. Helen Joyce.
Hilary Cass did the biggest and best systematic evidence review. Riitta Kerttu-Kaltiala in Finland has done entire population studies. They really don't show anything remotely like gender-affirming care being sensible. And if we're going to bring up WPATH, one of the chapters in WPATH Standards of Care 8 is entitled Eunuchs. And it says that people can have a eunuch gender identity. and that it might be appropriate to intervene if a man says he's a eunuch, for example, to remove his testicles or to give him drugs to make his testicles not work. And what we're hearing is that people have gender identities and that they're able to tell them from the age of 4 or 5. And what I'd like to know is, if a little boy, 4 or 5-year-old, say, says, "Mummy, I don't think I want my willy, I don't think I want my balls," might we say to them, "Oh, WPATH says that you might be a eunuch. There's a eunuch gender identity. It might actually be appropriate to cut off your testicles and your willy." I'm not sure yet. We might have to wait a bit and see. I don't see what's wrong with what I'm saying here within the paradigm that Helen Webberley is talking about, where people know who they are, they know who they are from 4 or 5.
Once again, we have a 6-year-old saying, "Mummy, Daddy, I don't want my penis and my testicles," and then rushing towards the surgery to have them removed. It's just, these small cases or that we're citing as examples to throw the
But they are legitimate
population.
cases.
No.
That's an entire chapter.
Excuse me. I've never, ever met a 6-year-old child come to me and say, I'm a eunuch and I want my penis and testicles cut off. I have met thousands and thousands and thousands of transgender people who identify as a different gender and would like to have gender affirming care, and that care medical intervention isn't needed until puberty. So we hear all these alarmist bottom of the thing cases because we're not talking to true physicians and medical professionals.
My point was really about WPATH being massively important and experts, over 200 medical experts, yada yada, and yet they bring out a standards of care that has an entire chapter about eunuch gender identity. That's why I don't pay any attention to WPATH and why I'd prefer to listen to Hilary Cass and to Rita Kertukaltiala in Finland.
We're going to be back in just a moment and we'll be talking about cross-sex hormones. You are listening to the Times Radio Gender Debate with two Helens, Helen Joyce and Helen Webberley. I said we'd talk about cross-sex hormones and we'll describe, or hopefully two Helens will describe exactly what they are. But the vast majority of people who are prescribed puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormones. And that is the hormone that will bring on the sexual characteristics of their chosen gender. And Helen Webberley, I'm right in saying that that is irreversible once you are on cross-sex hormones.
The gender affirming hormones is the word that we use, but the day you start gender affirming hormones doesn't mean that it's automatically irreversible from that minute onwards, because what gender affirming hormones does in someone who is taking puberty blockers is it starts a second puberty, and that second puberty takes as long as the first puberty to fully develop, and along that trajectory then the irreversible changes will occur, which is what the patient wants.
But along that they're irreversible by the time you've been through a programme of it. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, what age could they be prescribed at?
Well, that varies really, because puberty blockers are easy. They're the best time they're given is when puberty starts, because you want to block puberty. For gender affirming hormones, because it is a second stage of treatment, it varies and it should be guided by individual choice.
Right. How do you regard them, Helen Joyce?
I mean, in this country, we've now banned puberty blockers, and rightly, because there's no evidence base for their use. They don't improve mental health, and there are increasing worries that they're very harmful. And we say that we don't give cross-sex hormones on the NHS until 16 and preferably 18.
Right. So if they're banned, puberty blockers at the moment, then...
Well, Helen Joyce says again, she's not a medic, so it's very difficult to
fine,
do
and you've made that point on many occasions. But if they are blocked, what do you say to your patients? They can't get them now.
Sorry, so puberty blockers, there's a government ban on puberty blockers,
yes,
only in transgender children and only until the age of, I forget now whether it's 16 or 18.
And you welcome that?
No, I don't. It's tragic, absolutely tragic.
Right. Helen Joyce.
I mean, the evidence showed that they didn't do any of the things they were promised to do. Obviously, they block puberty, but they don't make the children function better mentally, and they're harmful.
Right. You obviously don't support that ban. Do you prescribe cross-sex hormones instead to young people?
The options for young people who can't have puberty blockers, the ones that are banned, which are the GnRH analogues, is that they can take other medicines to suppress their natural hormone production or the effects of their natural hormone.
So are you prescribing cross-sex hormones?
I don't prescribe any, but that's up because I don't practice as a doctor at the moment. I don't prescribe. But doctors in this country will use other medicines to suppress puberty or the effects of puberty.
Are your colleagues and partners at Gender GP prescribing cross-sex hormones?
Cross-sex hormones, yeah.
Right, even though puberty blockers are banned, and you would normally start on those and go on to cross-sex hormones.
I don't know if you understood my answer, but there are different ways. So basically, the two necessary interventions for a transgender child or adolescent are to suppress the effects of or production of the natural hormone and replace it with the opposite hormone, if we like. And there are many different ways to do that and many different schedules to do that.
Right, but without puberty blockers being prescribed because they're banned, are colleagues of yours at Gender GP prescribing cross-sex hormones to under 16-year-olds?
Well, not because of.
But are they?
Not,
All right,
yes, yes. The doctors in this country and in Europe are prescribing
to under 16-year-olds
hormones to under 16-year-olds.
How young?
Well, I don't know how young. I don't know. But whenever it's medically indicated to do that, this isn't about age. Everyone uses the age thing as the alarmist thing. Oh my goodness, that's too young. But don't forget that puberty progresses, and if we don't intervene, what you end up with is life-altering, irreversible effects of the other hormone. So it's like the same life-changing, irreversible effects of the hormone that we prescribe. If you don't do it, you end up with the life-altering, irreversible effects of the hormone from the natural body.
I mean, I don't know how many times I can say that people are either male or female and sex can't change. So if you give a male person female hormones, that doesn't mean that they go through female puberty. A male person can't go through female puberty. So the pathway that Helen Webberley is describing is a pathway that leads to adult sterility. Your own sex organs will not develop. I mean,
was that answering your question? Because we seem to have gone back to the fact that gender identity doesn't exist, and now we're straight back on sterility.
I brought in the word sterility here. So this
but
is
are you saying there are no
us
side effects, and that none of the patients that you have treated have ever suffered the sorts of side effects that Helen Joyce has just outlined?
I mean, I don't know how balanced this is becoming, but the side effects of gender-affirming hormones are the effects that person wants. So, for example, somebody who is given, and Helen calls it you can't have a female puberty. Let's call it an estrogen puberty.
Right.
And the effects of the estrogen puberty are the effects that the person wants.
Well, you say that that's what they want. Kira Bell was
we're going to go
an
on to,
example.
Again, we're going to go on to a case of one, which is really difficult.
These are a lot of cases, though, aren't they? I mean, I've pulled out a few.
Could we talk about the 262,000 people in this country, or do we just want to talk about one Kira Bell?
That sounds like you're dismissing it. But Kira Bell went to court. The puberty blockers that I received at 16 were designed to stop my sexual maturation. The idea was that this would give me a pause to think about whether I wanted to continue to a further gender transition. This so-called pause put me into what felt like menopause, with hot flushes, night sweats and brain fog. All this made it more difficult to think clearly about what I should do. By the end of a year of this treatment, when I was presented with the option of moving on to testosterone, I jumped at it. I wanted to feel like a young man, not an old woman. I was eager for the shots to start and the changes this would bring. But it's very clear that they weren't thinking clearly. Does it give you pause for thought, Helen Webberley?
Well, you see, Kira Bell went through the Tavistock. The Tavistock didn't, and what the Tavistock said was, regardless of your age, you must have puberty blockers for a year before gender-affirming hormones.
And that was wrong.
And that's what Kira Bell had. So Kira Bell did have an estrogen menopause and then had to endure that for a year and then had testosterone. But that's not what, if you have a look at the Endocrine Society guidelines and WPATH standards of care, that's not the clinical guidance that they would have done.
Did it give you pause for thought, that case?
And that is what was criticised by the CAS review and the Clare Care Quality Commission, because they weren't following standards.
Does that reassure you?
I mean, if I can give a big number, 96% of female people who take testosterone for gender-affirming care will get pelvic floor dysfunction. I'd very much like to know if that is what is said to them, because it's very bad for female sex organs.
Where does that stat come from? Can we have that clearly?
That comes from a paper by a physiotherapist who has looked into it, because she treats a lot of them. I can provide you with the source afterwards, since clearly you need to know it. But obviously, it is not good for female sex organs to have testosterone.
But again,
do you talk to your patients about that? That sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Of course we discuss all of those things.
Right.
But pelvic floor dysfunction...
To a 12-year-old, would they know necessarily what that means and what effect that might have later in life?
Well, you're back to the gender-affirming care in 12-year-olds. So the 12-year-old is on puberty blockers. I've never heard this statistic that's come forward. How many patients were in this study? Do you know?
I
Helen
asked
Joyce?
a friend who did the study, so
Your
I'd have to
friend?
come back to you.
Okay.
Elaine Miller, she's an extremely well-known
but we're not-
physiologist.
You
Yeah.
might find a study that's got 8 people. I don't know. I've not seen this study. And you might say, oh, goodness, 94%. So maybe 7 of them had pelvic floor dysfunction. But what you have to understand is that if medics go on proper research and guidance and
right.
standards that are peer reviewed, not one single paper that you can find which may have a very tiny number of cases that shows what the other side wants to see.
I know. Oh yes, go on.
The CAS review is the systematic review here, and it just doesn't show that this pathway has evidence behind it.
Can I bring up another case?
Sure.
I know you think I'm picking cases, but I'm trying to give a sense of cases that have come to light, that have gone through the courts. Can I just do it, and then you can say
to the rest of the population when you use one case.
Or is it
case.
highlighting it? I mean, you're a champion of this, and you've been able to defend yourself. Let me give you this case. Let's look at the case that was examined in the family court in the UK. Gender GP prescribed testosterone to a child known as Jay, who had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and had a history of anorexia. In fact, had spent 9 months in hospital under the Mental Health Act because of malnutrition. Jay came to you Jay came to you aged 14.
Which case
and
was this,
with
please?
3. It just comes under Jay.
Which court was this and which country was this? Because that's
the
not
family
UK.
court. Family court in the UK. It was the family division here. I'll just finish. Jay came to you aged 14 and within 3 months was prescribed testosterone. And I suppose the question is, did you order any blood tests or bone x-rays before prescribing gender-affirming hormones to Jay?
I don't know this case, and it's not my my patient. I don't know the ins and outs of this case.
Would you have done if someone had come presented to you with those issues, those conditions,
issues, sorry?
autism spectrum disorder and a history of anorexia? Would you have ordered blood tests or bone x-rays before?
I'm interested. What do you think the blood tests would have shown with the autism and anorexia and gender dysphoria? Because they don't show up on a blood test and they don't show up on a brain scan. And this again is when we've got people.
Well, an independent expert looked at Jay's medical notes and
Who
said
was
that
the
Jay
expert?
was at an independent expert was at risk
we need
of
to understand.
sudden death.
Yeah, but if we're
it
going to do
sounds
this-
like you are trying to split hairs, Helen Webberley, instead of saying yes, we would have done all the due diligence that was necessary.
The due diligence is dictated by WPATH and Endocrine Society. You can talk about splitting hairs with one patient who might have had autism and anorexia, but by using that one case to dictate or let all of your listeners decide whether gender-affirming care and gender incongruence, gender-affirming care is the right thing to do and gender incongruence exists, it's really unhelpful to use one case when there are hundreds and millions of transgender people across the world.
The family court
Hundreds in
says that child was put on testosterone at such a high level that they were at risk of sudden death.
Can I just wrap this up, because we haven't got much time left, by asking a question to both of you, but starting with you, Helen Joyce. If we go back to the beginning and we look at the interpretation from the Supreme Court ruling, you used the word we've won, or we've won that case. Do you think it is time to be generous to the transgender community, to be a bit more benevolent, perhaps, to the sort of work that Helen Webberley is doing or not?
I think the work that Helen Webberley is doing is absolutely malevolent. I think she's doing enormous harm to children. I
take a line at disagreeing with that on there.
I think that the kindest thing to do to people who identify as trans is absolutely not to give them evidence-free, harmful medicine, and I think that's what she's doing. And this type of care is not going to last. It is going to be looked back on with horror.
Do you agree with that? Do you think it will be looked back in horror?
I think absolutely not. I think this present time in history is going to look back in horror when there are thousands and thousands of transgender people not accepted, hurting, being harmed by these kind of views.
Thank you to both of you. That's all we have time for.
Thank you.